Okay, I think we'll get started. My name is Bruce Stillman. I'm president of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and I'd like to welcome you all here to Grace Auditorium to an interesting collaboration between the North Shore Land Alliance and Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on probably one of the most important topics in society these days, climate change and the way forward. I also want to thank the garden clubs and St. John's Church for also helping out with this program, and thank you all for attending. This is a great audience on a Monday night, I think it is. I've been traveling a lot, but I think it's Monday. So society is faced with a lot of major problems, and infectious disease around the world, poverty, and climate change is up there with some of the most important issues that we have to deal with. But I think of all of the issues that are present today, climate change is probably the one thing that has the potential to have the biggest impact in the long term. And that'll impact a lot of other issues that also are going to be big issues in the next century, including food, water, and natural resources and other issues like that. But I think climate change may actually usurp all of those and influence all of those so significantly that this will become the central issue for us. That's not ignoring all of the things that Cold Spring Harbor is focused on, which is human health and mental health and cancer and issues like that. But we do have a very strong, as you'll find, a very strong plant program here, plant biology program, that in part is focused on basic discovery science, but in part is really focused on trying to improve plants that will help with solving some of the issues of climate change, such as food production, water issues, and the ability of plants to grow in environments for which they really don't exist now. So we have a very, I just met the panelists except for one of them who works at Cold Spring Harbor, I've known for a long time. I just met the panelists earlier, but I want to thank the North Shore Land Alliance. They're a great organization. They do a lot for promoting conservation of land and in this area. And I want to introduce Lisa Ott, who is going to introduce Katie to you, but also I hope say some things about the Land Alliance. Thank you for coming.
Good evening. It's so nice to see all of you here caring about our world and caring about climate and the future and food. And there are lots of questions when it comes to food. I'd also like the Nature Conservancy, who is one of our sponsors and is doing so much work in this realm. So as most of you are aware, we're nearing a tipping point with the impact of climate change and a reality that we don't have as much time as we thought we did. Original studies said we had 20 to 30 years to work on this, but now they're saying it's more than like 10 to 15 years where we need to avoid irreversible damage to our ecosystems, agriculture, forests, and communities. So we are here, and the decisions that we make going forward are decisions that will impact our lives and those of the world's. One of the biggest questions we have to address, and the reason so many of us are here tonight, is how do we feed 9 billion people without destroying the planet? I don't know the answers, but much like you, I'd like to learn more. And as Bruce said, we are very happy to be here with the Cold Spring Harbor Lab and all of you. And the North Shore Land Alliance, if you don't know who we are, is a land trust. And our objective is to protect land for habitat, for recreation, for clean water, and for the ability to produce food. So we are very fortunate tonight to have 4 outstanding presenters with us. The first is Katie Kinsolving, who is my friend, and also a cooking teacher for over 25 years in the UK and in the United States. She's a food writer and a food blogger, and a co-founder of Sea Change Conversations, a nonprofit that promotes nonpartisan discussion on climate change around the country. She's also vice chair for Food and Climate and Agriculture for the Conservation and National Affairs and Legislation Committee of the Garden Club of America, and has recently joined the staff at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies as manager of special projects. And we have Dr. Rebecca Benner, the Director of Conservation and Science for the Nature Conservancy of New York, where she manages a team that works on climate change, water, and agriculture. Previously, Rebecca worked for the Inter-American Development Bank in their Natural Resources and Agriculture Division, focusing on biodiversity and ecosystem services projects in Latin America. In this role, she lived in Jamaica and worked extensively on watershed conservation and rural agricultural conservation projects. Sorry, I'm not a good presenter like Bruce, I still have to read. Rebecca grew up in developing communities, including Ecuador, Bangladesh, and India, which has given her a great appreciation for the need to balance human and environmental needs. Dr. Doreen Ware from the Cold Spring Harbor Lab is a molecular biologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service and adjunct professor at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. She is recognized as a leader in plant genomics, and bioinformatics. Over the last several years, her laboratory has contributed to collaborative projects involving the complexities of grain, yield, and responses to nitrogen. And the rest of her qualifications are even more complicated than that, so I will not insult her by trying to name the many extraordinary things she's done. But I do know she's also a soccer mom, because her son's game was canceled yesterday. And she, like the rest of us, care about the future and our children. Peter Lehner is a tough guy. Prior to finding his love for agriculture, Peter created and led the Environmental Prosecution Unit of the New York City Law Department. Peter was the executive director of the National Resources Defense Council and the NRDC Action Fund from 2007 to 2015, where he shaped a clean food program with food waste, antibiotic-free meat, regional food and climate mitigation projects. Today, he directs Earth Justice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program, where he develops strategies to promote a more environmentally sound agricultural system to reduce health, environmental, and climate harms from the production of our food, and farms 2 large coffee plantations in Costa Rica. So he is tough, and he's actually in the field and on the farm. Now, I'm pleased to invite Katie to guide us through the rest of our quest. Thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. Good evening, and thank you, Lisa, and it's lovely to be here at this incredible place that I've always heard so much about, so very excited to be at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. I want to start off our exploration of food and climate by taking a look at my version of a history of farming. And I'd like you to bear with me for a minute. I want to begin with farmers who were working the land millions of years ago, farmers who made this planet what it is today, farmers who had a vital trading economy, a secondary underground barter economy, and a sophisticated disposal system. I can see some of the scientists going, what is she talking about? And I'm speaking, of course, about plants. Early plant life harvested energy from the sun and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and combined them to create food. Like many modern farming operations, this process created waste, and the waste product was called oxygen. Animals emerged on the scene and did 3 things. They used the plant's waste product of oxygen in order to breathe. They ate the plants, and then they breathed out more carbon dioxide, which helped the remaining plants to thrive. And without this natural trading system, this natural trading economy, if you will, of exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide, we would not be here. Oh, I get to use one of these laser pointers. I want you to just look at this area down here where it says soil stores excess carbon, because this is really a secondary barter economy that is just as important to us. In this underground economy, plants send some of the carbon down through their root tips into the soil to trade to microbes in exchange for nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. And there's this beautiful network of mycorrhizal fungi that facilitates this exchange. And then there's this beautiful disposal system, right? plants have that they've created. So when plants and the animals that ate them die, the leaves and the stems and the bones decompose and sink deep, deep, deep within the soil. And over time, with time and pressure and millions of years, they've become these pools of carbon-rich oil, natural gas, and coal, safely stored and sequestered out of the system. So when you think about it this way, everything that we eat, wear, drive, fly, make, build is dependent on these plant-based systems. Okay, so that was my chapter 1 on a brief history of farming. We're going to zoom through hundreds of millions of years to the next chapter. And we have here, oh gosh, I get to use this again. This bottom axis that shows us goes from 20,000 years ago to now, and this axis, which is in Fahrenheit, and it shows us temperature change above and below 0, but the 0 is actually standing in for 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the average global temperature. And you can see that 20,000 years ago, we were in an ice age, and then gradually over the course of 11,000 years, the temperature warmed by 7 degrees, and we came out of the ice age and arrived at this Goldilocks number here of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is when agriculture emerged. That is when humans started mimicking plants and got into this sort of systemic food production. And that's important because, as you can see, civilizations appeared. There were trade routes. Economies grew. Okay, that was chapter 2. Now we're zooming along to chapter 3. And I want you to take a look at this. I love this map, A, because of its sort of old-time look. But also, it really shows you that the roots of our economy are in America's fertile soil. In the 19th century, North American land, productive North American land and hardworking farmers created enough food to feed our country with enough left over to trade to the countries of the world. And to get that food to the countries of the world and across our country, infrastructure was required. So we needed canals and canal barges and steamboats and railroads and eventually airports and airplanes. And all of this infrastructure, of course, also generated other industries like our steel industry and our fossil fuel industries. And then in the 20th century, global populations trebled, and we exuberantly took on the challenge of feeding the world. So we subsidized industrialized agriculture, we added chemical fertilizers and bigger machines, we consolidated small family farms into big corporate farms for market efficiency, and we simplified our crop choices to a few, predominantly corn, soy, wheat, and cotton. All of these choices had an impact on our climate. We now know that modern farming methods are responsible for almost a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to take a look at what those emissions are. And I want to start with the media star in this story, the cow in the field. These animals give us energy through their meat and also through dairy, and we eat a lot of both. Last year, per capita, Americans ate 57 pounds of beef and 630 pounds of dairy. Current cattle rearing methods contribute greenhouse gas emissions in 5 ways, and I want to go through them pretty quickly. I think we have all heard that cows emit methane when they belch, and these methane-rich belches account for 35% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, so 35% of the 25%, right? Animals also leave waste, and according to the Centers for Disease Control, the manure lagoons in concentrated animal feeding operations emit significant amounts of methane and nitrous oxide, two of the most potent greenhouse gases. So methane and nitrous oxide do not last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which lasts for 40 generations, right? The carbon we're putting in today is going to be here 40 generations from now. But methane and nitrous oxide, while they're here, they have a much bigger warming potential. Okay, on to number 3, deforestation. Livestock production is the largest user of land in the world. So in 2018, 30 million acres of tropical forests were lost to agriculture, most of it to support cattle. Forests are being cleared both to make way for grazing and to make way for crops like soy and corn that is used to feed the cows, right? And speaking of corn, corn is one of our major crops in America. I think I just read that we have 90 million acres in production. And to use it, to grow it, we use a lot of synthetic fertilizer, which brings us to issue number 4. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is spread on corn, and I didn't really understand why this was such a big contributor to greenhouse gases until I did a little digging. First of all, it kept millions of people from starving in the last century because it boosts plant production. But in order to create synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, you have to take the basic component, which is natural gas, and heat it. So they're the energy inputs from heating it. That's one form of natural gas. There's the natural gas that is its basic ingredient. And then once you put synthetic fertilizer onto the cropland, some is indeed taken up by the crops, but any that is on the soil is taken up by soil microbes, and they convert it to nitrous oxide. And the bits that are left over are sent into our streams and our waterways, wreaking havoc there with algal blooms, which also emit methane. And the final cattle-related issue is loss of wetlands. Approximately half of this country's wetlands have been drained, much of it to make way for agriculture, and much of that is for livestock and, again, corn and soy production. In fact, if you think about it, humans have been farming in the floodplains since the Fertile Crescent, right, which is really the floodplains of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The issue here is that wetlands are exceptionally good at absorbing carbon. So when we drain them, we're losing that carbon absorption tool. And secondly, when the peat that lies at the bottom of these wetlands is dried out, it oxidizes, and it emits carbon dioxide. And I'm not even going to get into how we're losing all those fantastic ecosystems and the flood barriers, et cetera. But it's a big deal. So all of these contribute to a big carbon footprint for beef and dairy. And you can see here, this is beef, cheese, and then milk is down here. And it's just outsized. So when people say, what is the big deal? That's the big deal with beef. That's why. But then I thought, okay, so that's beef, but it looks like rice is over there. And indeed, it turns out that the planting of some plants, including rice, does contribute greenhouse gases. So rice is responsible for at least 10% of agricultural greenhouse gases. And that's because the wet fields where rice is grown are breeding grounds for microbes that produce methane. Rice is the staple crop for nearly half the world's population. So a lot of rice is grown and eaten. Another plant-related source is Elaeis guineacis. the source of palm tree oil, which is used in everything these days, from pasta sauces to hand lotion, lipstick, dried fruit, nut butters, even, sadly, ice cream. In Indonesia and Malaysia, we are cutting down acres and acres and acres of complex, carbon-rich tropical forests and wetlands to make way for plantations of this fast-growing single crop. And we're emitting carbon not only when we cut down the trees and the forests, but also from the newly bared soil. So speaking of soil, let's take a quick look at how our agricultural methods affect the ability of the soil to store carbon. Soil, as you probably know, is just crushed mineral-rich stones, water, air, and organic matter. And that organic matter is the fertility of our soil. That organic matter is made up of carbon-rich bits of decomposing plants and animals, right? Healthy soil is a fantastic interconnected world, rich in mycorrhizal fungi and microbial activity, teeming with chemical and biological messages sent through almost invisible tiny filaments called hyphae. This complex communications network is vital for our carbon cycle, and yet we rip it apart every time we till the soil, thus releasing carbon into the air. So when humans started tilling the soil, we started on a very minimal basis, right, with one farmer dragging the till or maybe a couple of oxen. And now we're using these huge tractors that can do acres and acres in a matter of hours. We had good reason to till the soil. It breaks up the land and aerates it. It prevents the spread of weeds. And it makes it easier to insert seeds, right? So all of our agricultural equipment is designed to insert seeds into tilled soil that has those nice, tidy rows. But the downside is that tearing up the soil rips apart our carbon storage system at our feet and exposes the organic matter to the sun and to oxygen, which, of course, destroy it, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Just to give you an idea of this, organic carbon content of Iowa soils has gone from 5%, which is considered pretty healthy, to 3% in the last 100 years. Critically, tilling is also making soil vulnerable to erosion, and we're going to see why that is such an issue in a minute. Globally, we are losing about 1% of topsoil a year, about 10 times that rate in this country and 20 to 30 times that rate in Asia. So that's soil. And then there's one other major contributor on the food system side, and I think we all probably know what that is too, and it's the food we throw away. 30 to 40% of our food is sent to landfill. So when food goes to landfill, it's sort of piled high, and other things are piled on top and pressed down, and it decomposes anaerobically without oxygen, and that process emits methane. Secondly, if you think about all the energy that went into producing that food, from the diesel for the tractor to the electricity for the irrigation system to the transportation, we're just taking 30 to 40% of that energy and we're just throwing it away. Okay, so now that was what I call the gloom section. Now we're going to move on to the doom section, and we're going to then have some optimism from our panel, I'm hoping. So we've examined how these agricultural systems make up a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, and I want to change track and look at what climate change has in store for us in terms of our farms, our farming methods, and food production. To start off, I want to share a couple of maps with you. And this is the map that woke me up to the severity of climate change. It is from the nonpartisan World Resources Institute and shows projected change in crop yields if the global average temperature rises by 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which some projections say could happen within 80 years, if we continue on our current path of emissions. Red indicates where crop yields will go down. Green indicates where yields will go up. And I want to also add that the models used to create this also indicate that if temperatures rise above 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, there's no green left on the map. But that's a projection. Where are we today, now? This is another interesting map. It's from our own NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it shows us that we are now, today, living in a world of extremes. Extreme drought is shown in all the areas in brown, and extreme moisture in all the blue areas. Scientists say that climate change will increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Now, I want to be clear here, climate change does not cause extreme weather events, but it amplifies the severity. So what are these extreme weather events doing to our farmland? Well, on the one hand, there are droughts caused by increased evaporation brought on by prolonged high temperatures. We also have less snowpack in our mountains, which leads to less snow melt in our once fertile valleys. I wish I could say that this was a colorized photo from the 1930s, but this photograph was taken in Arizona in the summer of 2018. Globally, there are about 1 billion acres of degraded agricultural land, land that has been over-tilled, over-irrigated, and overgrazed, land that is no longer arable. And this is happening at a time when our population is increasing from 7.5 billion to around 11 billion by century's end. And the good news is there are ways to rebuild the soil, and I hope we're going to hear about that in a minute before you get too depressed. So I want to move to the other side of the spectrum, flooding. Climate change exacerbates extreme rain events because warmer air holds more water vapor, and when it is released, more water comes down. And I think we've all seen these extreme rain events, certainly up in the Northeast, and actually in other countries as well. Again, weakened topsoil is really vulnerable to erosion during these flooding events. But that's not the only thing we're losing. We're losing crops and livestock. In 2018, Hurricane Florence hit North Carolina, and the farmers there lost $1 billion worth of crops and livestock. More recently, the bomb cyclone that hit Nebraska last March caused $900 million in losses. Flooding from that same storm cost Iowa farmers $2 billion in losses. And that this year's extreme wet spring has delayed planting, and that's going to have a knock-on effect on yields and prices and the economy. So we are already seeing these impacts. And even without extreme weather, just plain old warmer, wet conditions are perfect breeding grounds for blight, fungus, and insect proliferation. Current projections estimate that for each increase in land temperature of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, bugs and blight will destroy an additional 10 to 25% of our crops. Okay, seed dormancy and pollination. I didn't really understand what a big deal this was, but then a farmer friend of mine took me aside and said, Katie, you've got to add this in. The seeds of many crops need to be culled and dormant for a consistent long period of time every year. For example, peach trees and apple trees and cherry trees need 4 to 5 weeks of temperatures below 45 degrees in order to flower and fruit. And some of our agricultural regions are just not seeing these consistent temperatures below 45 degrees. And on top of that, we're having this weird weather where we get warm winters and then we get a blizzard in April, right? Plants are flowering out of sync with their natural pollinators so that once they do flower, the chances of being fertilized are much reduced, and that, of course, is having a knock-on effect on our pollinators. Some people say that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to help plants grow bigger and faster. And I have to say I love this picture. I don't know where I got it, but I love it. There's new research that suggests that the large plants will be much less nutritious for us because these plants are making more sugars as more carbon is available to them and squeezing out the other nutrients like iron and protein and zinc and even some B vitamins. And let's not forget that weeds and invasives will also be bigger and growing faster. But not all plants will grow bigger and faster. Plants, like humans, are stressed by heat. I just saw this article in The Economist that talks about last summer's potato crop in Northern Europe, where the potatoes were much, much smaller than usual. They had the same number of potatoes, but they were just tiny. And that is being attributed to climate change. And then finally, let's take a look at these 3 pillars of happiness. Coffee and chocolate are, of course, grown in the tropic zone within 20 degrees north and south of the equator. In the case of cacao trees, it is the projected decrease in humidity that is going to adversely affect production. And if you have any doubt about this, go on the Mars website or the Nestle website or any of those big candy conglomerates, and they are seriously worried about this. Coffee beans will be affected in a different way, and Peter, I hope you can corroborate this or correct me if I'm wrong, but coffee depends on a very specific temperature range, and when it is too hot, the fruit on the coffee tree ripens too quickly, and that degrades the quality of the bean within. Now, aside from those of us who depend on coffee to get through the day, 120 million people around the equator depend on coffee for their livelihood. And then there's wine. The microclimates of Europe's vineyards are shifting, and if you have read anything ever about wine cultivation, you know that the way a wine tastes is in direct response to the climate in which it is grown, right? In France and in Spain, conditions are getting too hot and too dry to make the wines that we are used to getting from those countries. But don't worry, the English and the Swedish have already planted vineyards, and in our country, there are already vineyards, I'm told, in northern Vermont. Who knew? Okay, so I feel like that set us up with the gloom and the doom, and now I'm hoping to turn to our panel to get some inspiration and some good news. I want to see what the path forward is. So, Rebecca, I wanted to start with you. The Nature Conservancy is so known for all of its mitigation efforts using nature-based systems. So are we going to be able to feed this growing population with these decreasing yields? Small question.
Well, thank you, Katie, and hopefully I can deliver on giving you guys some optimism. I think Katie painted the picture really appropriately. The agriculture is complicated. We need food to be able to survive. We waste a huge amount of our food, and yet there's huge numbers of people that are starving every day. Climate change is going to impact our ability to produce food, but also producing food impacts climate change. So it's this wonderful, complex web of craziness. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories tonight to sort of answer Katie's question, and she has set this up beautifully for me to be able to do that. I'm going to tell you about dirt, and I'm going to tell you about water. So basically, I'm going to talk to you about mud. Not sure if I drew the short straw on that one, but anyway, I'm going to talk to you about mud. But I'll start with dirt. I think Katie did a really lovely job of telling you all the issues around agriculture and soils. Of course, soils are critical. It's why we have more crops in certain places and fewer crops in other places. The richness of the soils and the nutrients that are in them feed agriculture. And so part of the reason that, as Katie mentioned, tillage was such a breakthrough, because it allowed for so many efficiencies in agriculture, it also helps churn up the soil, which means you're getting access to all those nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, that plants need to be able to grow. And of course, it comes with the consequences of the fact that you also then release carbon, and that can exacerbate global climate change. So the good news is that farmers are now recognizing that they're losing productivity because their soils are no longer as healthy. Healthy soils help retain water, help retain nutrients, and just allows them to be more productive from year to year and grow more crops. So this is a first potential win-win situation where farmers, at least in our experience at the Nature Conservancy, and we do a lot of work with farmers, particularly up in sort of the central western area of New York, and then of course across the entire globe, if you're talking about the whole rest of the Nature Conservancy. Farmers have been really interested in understanding how can they actually start to replenish their soils through their practices. And so there's really 3, maybe 4 practices that can really encourage greater soil health. The first is reducing the amount of tillage that you use. You don't actually have to till the soils as regularly or as much as we do, and you can still produce food. And the less you till, the less you actually dig up those nutrients and all that organic matter, the less you lose carbon, but also, you know, the less erosion problems you have. You're not so likely to lose that topsoil. It's actually it stays on the farm more. The second is plant cover crops. So a lot of the times when you're driving around an agricultural landscape in the winter, you'll just see denuded fields with nothing on them. If you leave crops on the farm over the winter, it actually helps keep the soil in place. Because you can imagine, if you just have dirt and you get a major rainstorm, a major windstorm, it actually leaves the fields. But if you have crops planted on it, the roots hold it in place. That's what plants are good at. The third thing is actually rotate different types of crops through your field system. Some crops actually put nitrogen back into the soil, nitrogen-fixing crops. So you can actually replenish the nutrients and the food the agricultural systems and the food the plants need by actually planting different crops in different places. And the last practice is manure management. Katie talked a lot about the fact that especially the concentrated animal feeding operations produce a lot of liquid manure. If you manage manure correctly and use composting really well, you can actually use some of the nutrients that are in there as a method to replenish your soils without having to rely on chemical fertilizers. So the farmers like this because, in theory, they can actually start to replenish their own soils, spend less money on fertilizers, and over time see greater crop production. The hurdle is that it is over time. So there is this win-win where we can actually decrease impacts to climate change, still continue to grow food, and actually potentially make crop production more economically viable for farmers. But there's a lag time, 10 to 20 years before they'll start to see changes in yields. Peter has great solutions to that issue. It has to do with incentives and how can we create policies and better direction for farmers to be able to capitalize on that opportunity. So I'll let him talk about those solutions. I'm just talking about the natural resource happy solutions. So the other story I wanted to talk about was water. And once again, Katie set this up beautifully, talking about the fact that we have too little water, too much water, not the right amount of water at the right time of year. And this actually links to the soil conversation, because if you have healthy soils, you can actually absorb more of that water during the wet parts, release some of that water during the dry times, so you can actually balance some of those fluctuations better and actually still produce crops. But the other component that really impacts, that agriculture really impacts that has to do with water is, of course, runoff from agriculture. So once again, tying back to soils, if we don't have to apply so many synthetic fertilizers and our topsoils aren't so loose, we won't have so much runoff whenever we have a rain event into river systems, into lakes. So New York, and of course here in Long Island, we're seeing the impacts of too many nutrients in our water all the time. Here on Long Island, you guys have a single source aquifer. You have massive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. The nitrogen, bulk of it does come from wastewater and septic tanks, but there's also, of course, contributions from agricultural runoff. It's not unique. Across New York, 80% of our water bodies are above the EPA mandated standard for phosphorus, for example. You're seeing harmful algal blooms in every single Finger Lake. Every single one of them, even the pristine ones. So we are having these major issues, and it's not just agriculture. There are phosphorus and nutrient sources coming from many different places. But of course, runoff from agriculture is one of the major contributors and a huge source. Luckily, the good news is there's also solutions there. I talked about solutions like cover crops and crop rotation. Those are called on-farm practices. They're also what's called edge-of-field practices, where you can actually plant buffers between agricultural landscapes and waterways. Those can be bushes, they can be trees, they can be wetlands, which has the double benefit of storing huge amounts of carbon in the soils and helping mitigate climate change. But that's a more complicated solution than the soil health practices, in that to do edge-of-field practices, you're really taking land out of production. So whereas soil health, you're actually encouraging greater production, with edge-of-field practices, you take land out of production. Doesn't make it undoable, it still makes it necessary, but the incentives that we'll need to really drive that kind of practice at scale are going to be different and more complicated. And again, Peter's going to talk a little bit more about some of those types of policies and incentives that we can create. So I think the answer to your question is yes. I think we can feed the global human population. I think if we were able to deal with some of the food distribution issues, and if we're able to start implementing some of these sustainable practices in a mixture and in a matrix way, we can actually produce the food that we need to feed the global population without deforesting massive areas of the Amazon, and can still be economically viable for our farmers.
Yay. Okay. So that's nature-based systems. Now I want to turn to our scientists. Doreen, how does your work on development traits address the climate challenge?
So my group is really interested in understanding what's in a plant genome. When I think about a plant genome, I think of it as having the map that tells us how that plant's going to grow and potentially how it's going to respond to the environment. The other thing the plant genome allows us to do is it actually allows us an understanding of a plant's life history, what's its experience, and potentially how it's adapted to that experience. So when you look at, for instance, the differences between wild varieties and domesticated crops, for instance, in rice, you can actually look at these genomes and you can see whether certain genes have been selected for, and those genes, in many cases, will have had a benefit or a fitness effect. In looking at these genomes, we can actually discover in the wild varieties disease resistance genes that don't exist in some of our cultivated crops. So having access to these genomes actually gives us an opportunity to look into their life history, understand how they've adapted in the different climates, in the different environments, and potentially look at the genes that were involved in those adaptations. And basically understanding those mechanisms can help us think about how we might make other crops adapt who haven't experienced that. Because when we're looking at this global climate change, what we're really looking at is the crops or the plants that are in one location are going to be experiencing very different environments. And so we want to be able to think about ways that we can either train those crops more rapidly to address to those conditions, and how to potentially provide them more information on the deal with the changing environment. So in my group, looking at those genomes, I've told you that example where we can compare many, many different genomes and identify disease resistance genes and think about how we might deploy those in those different crops to deal with climate change, where we see many different disease vectors coming along and changes. The other way we can use the information on genomes, which is now tractable to get. So my group was involved in the maize genome sequencing project and then the rice genome sequencing project, as well as working with commodity group grape. That first genome cost $50 million. I can now produce a genome for under $6,000. All right? So this is much like how we're looking at cancer as well. And when we think about agriculture now, we can think about precision agriculture. So now that we have more and more genomes available, we can actually think about how to optimize how we manage the fields. We can understand better the molecular mechanisms associated with nitrogen use efficiency or nitrogen uptake. we can actually make informed decisions based on data on when to apply those nitrogen applications, and perhaps even how to improve the way the plant uptakes nitrogen. Okay, so in my group, we've been involved in looking at the genomes and using molecular approaches to identify the genes that are involved in nitrogen use efficiency. So we can then identify genes that could potentially be deployed to improve the performance of the roots in the soil, to improve the number of transporters that can uptake nitrogen so that the plant can be more efficient. So one of the ways that we can be sustainable is to understand how plants sense nitrogen, how they uptake and how they utilize it, and can we breed plants that'll actually do this better so it'll be more sustainable. One of the things that has happened with being able to have access to the genomes now is we can build better mechanisms to improve the breeding cycle. A traditional breeding cycle to improve a plant would normally take almost 11 years to go from starting a breeding program to a release of a product. With the way that we can handle the data today, we can now, instead of selecting for a very specific one trait, one gene, we can select over the whole genome. And it's shifted those breeding cycles from 10 years to almost down to 3 years, right? Yeah. So we now have the ability with the data that we have to accelerate breeding cycles that can actually bring in beneficial traits. Another thing that we can think about when we're dealing with the sustainability problem, a decrease in the amount of space, is we want to grow plants that will produce more outcomes in the same area. So another way that my group has been working on looking at genomes and using genetic approaches is we've been able to identify in one of the plants that I work on, sorghum, which is a very drought-tolerant plant. We also now understand that that plant only makes half of its flowers fertile to produce seeds. But we actually know the mechanism by which we can treat the plant, so now all of the flowers are fertile, so it's producing twice as much seed. And we can actually breed the plant in such a way that it's now producing twice as many seeds because all the flowers are fertile. So we can use approaches by understanding the mechanisms to actually improve the amount that we grow in the same space. So I think that there are opportunities now using many of these molecular approaches, and the fact that technology is now actually driven by really human health, the ability to sequence genomes, the ability to do inexpensive sequencing, and the ability to basically do things in a high throughput way are allowing us to generate more and more information about many crops and many other biodiverse plants that we can actually learn from those genomes, and then we can learn how we might use the tricks that one plant has learned and apply it to another. So I think that this really gives us a lot of hope in the future that we may be able to actually basically treat these plants in such a way that they can learn new tricks. I'll take that example of we're talking about grape. So if you look at Napa Valley and you look at what that drought, what that the cold days are, bud burst is going to be really critical. Maybe in 20 years there won't be enough cold days to actually have the grapes produce grapes. But perhaps if we understood mechanistically how the plant is perceiving those temperatures, we might be able to trick it into thinking it's seen those cold days even though it really hasn't. So understanding those molecular mechanisms may give us alternative strategies to be able to actually grow many of these plants even in the changing climate. And that's the way that we need to be thinking about it. So while I do believe that we are in a very, very critical time and that we cannot ignore it, we have a very limited time. We have many things that are coming down technology-wise that can help us potentially address these problems. And I think we should be using all the arsenals. We should be using land management practices. We should be using information of what plants have learned in different environments and how we could apply that to other plants. And then we certainly need to be thinking about the policies that actually manage how we do agriculture in this country and in other parts of the world. And I think that Peter will be addressing that.
Peter.
Thank you. You can see why one of our main recommendations for what this country needs is a lot more agricultural research. Our federal agricultural research is about half of what it was only 20 years ago, and much of that, and only about 1 or 2% of that is directed at strategies that will help us deal with climate change. And listening to Doreen's work makes it clear why we need a lot more of that research. Everything that we've talked about, that Rebecca talked about, are all practices that have been pretty well demonstrated on a shoestring by farmers doing this on their own. They've been demonstrated, the good news is they've been demonstrated in all regions of the country on virtually all crops and virtually all sizes. But if we actually put the type of energy into thinking a little bit more about them, we would know a lot more about cover crops, ideal rotations, mulch management, manure management. All of these things have enormous potential. Already they're extraordinarily powerful practices, but we've only begun to really look at them. The challenge we have now is that we have these great practices, we know a lot about them, but overall they're used on only about 1 to 4% of US cropland. The vast majority of our food comes from operations, you really can't use the word farm, that don't use cover crops, don't rotate their crops, don't manage their manure in this way, don't use buffer zones, or any of these other practices. So from the perspective of policy, the question isn't really what do we do? The question is, we know what we need to do, and how can we accelerate adoption of those practices? And one way, as I mentioned, is a lot more research. The more we knew about them, we probably would be able to make better arguments in favor of them. But we know enough already, so how can we accelerate those practices now? Well, one obvious answer is stop incentivizing stupid practices, which is actually what we spend billions of dollars on. And unfortunately, the federal farm bill, which doles out both money for nutrition assistance but also to support the farm industry, often does so in ways that create incentives for unfortunate practices. The way we shell out subsidies for specific crops makes it much harder to use crop rotations because of the way your payments are calculated. The way we pay crop insurance, and oh, by the way, when you mentioned that the farmers would lose $1 billion in Iowa, it's actually they won't. You and I will, because virtually all of those losses will be covered by crop insurance and federal disaster relief. And yet, the way that crop insurance works largely encourages planting in marginal areas, so areas that both, when tilled, lose a lot more carbon and are ultimately less productive. They also, there have been some changes recently, discourage the use of cover crops because of what are called termination guidelines and other things. And the conservation programs that are currently operated don't require us to choose the most important lands, such as the buffer lands that have tremendous ecological value and would be the lands that we want to conserve. So our farm policy right now is directed pretty much entirely at shoveling money to farmers without thought of sustainability or how we're both going to become more resilient to climate change and also how we can stop contributing to it. In addition to changing what I would call the current system of unfortunate subsidies, we can also put some strings on the subsidies. Most polls show that even though farmers tend to be reluctant to accept the idea of regulation, the notion of having some sort of quid pro quo, maybe a bad term right now, but some sort of strings attached to billions of dollars of federal payments isn't unreasonable. there are some federal programs already that in order to get your payments, you have to ensure that you are not converting wetlands, for example, or that you have a plan to prevent erosion on what's known as highly erodible land. These are good conditions. These are programs that only came into effect relatively recently. Compliance, as you can imagine, is minimal, unfortunately. Enforcement and oversight is minimal. So the existing program can be beefed up. But in addition, we could put a lot more conditions and ensure that farmers use a sort of core suite of sustainable measures, cover crops, broader rotations, buffer zones, et cetera, in order to get the billions of dollars that they are already getting. We can then also take some of this money and actually pay for better results. And it's not only federal farm money, but there's other money that is already being used for a number of other purposes. For example, in New York, we have clean water programs. That's great. But many of that money is now spent, let's just say, in not its most effective way. We can redirect money that was already being spent, already being sent to farmers, but often creating incentives for more problems down the road. For example, funding that goes to, say, enhance water efficiency sounds like a good thing. But if you're enhancing a water efficiency by installing irrigation in an area where the aquifer is already depleted and there's not enough rain, what you end up doing is just accelerating depletion of the aquifer, accelerating runoff of pollution, and not actually creating a long-term solution. So redirecting subsidies, that both farm subsidies, clean water subsidies, and others towards more productive opportunities is a great chance we have ahead. We can also think about more broadly, both from the farm system and more broadly the food system, what are we growing? What crops are we supporting, both in terms of our advertising, our food choices, our subsidies of growing? Katie mentioned the challenge of beef. One additional, when you think about how are we going to feed the world when we have more people, in addition to having more productive crops, we have to really think about what we're growing. It takes 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. If instead of feeding all that grain to cows, we ate it directly, we'd have essentially 15 times more food and be able to feed more people. We obviously have the food waste issue that Rebecca mentioned. Right now, a lot of the food we produce goes to waste. And there are many, for example, tree crops, which also being perennial crops, have deeper roots, store a lot more carbon in the soil, are more resilient to droughts and floods, but many of these tree crops also per acre are far more productive than many of our grain crops. So it's important to look at, when we think about the solutions, not only in terms of agriculture and change agricultural policy to change agricultural practices, but we also need to think about our food policies and our food choices. I'll mention one last example of a stupid policy that could be changed. A lot of grazing of cattle happens on federal land. Right now, a rancher that wants to use intense grazing practices where you rotate the cattle every day or almost every day to mimic the way the buffalo moved on the Great Plains, which allows them to eat everything there and then the land gets to recover for 3 or 4 months. That is largely impossible to do on federal rangeland because of federal policies. And indeed, if a federal rancher recognizes that the range is degraded and thinks, well, I want to put fewer animals, sheep or cattle, on that land to protect the land, federal policy actually doesn't allow him to do that. He has to put all the cattle that he's allotted on that land whether he wants to or not. And so those are examples of antiquated policies that need to be changed that could have tremendous impact in our policies, and why there is a chance, as we look at it, that agriculture could certainly be made carbon neutral. The food system, of course, is much more than agriculture. What happens after it leaves the crop, there's processing and transportation, and when you have your cup of coffee in the morning, Our coffee farm is one of the first to be carbon neutral, actually one of the first in the world to be carbon neutral. But it doesn't mean your cup of coffee is carbon neutral, because about half of the energy that goes into a cup of coffee is actually in your kitchen, boiling that water. So the food system is much broader than just agriculture, but we certainly can relatively, using these practices that were mentioned and the ones that we have coming up, could at least make agriculture carbon neutral.
So we've heard policy, and we've heard science, and we've heard nature-based solutions. Do you all have questions? Oh, we do have some questions. Okay. I think there's some microphones coming around. If you can just wait for the mics. That really gives me hope that you, well, all three of you have given me hope. Because when I've written this presentation, I was like, oh, this is so depressing. But knowing that we know what we need to do, we have the science that can help us figure these things out, and we have all these other practices that are tried and true is encouraging. Okay, go ahead.
I want to thank North Shore Land Alliance for tackling this multifaceted topic of food and climate, and Katie for showing us a graph that points to the carbon savings possible from a widespread shift away from animal products. And I'd like to ask Peter if you've seen any plans for assistance for farmers who want to transition from livestock business to plants. And I know that Finland had some success with their Dairies to Berries program. Success not only in terms of the agricultural transition, but also public health, because they saw a tremendous drop in their rate of cardiovascular disease. So are you aware of any such assistance or plans for that in this country?
No. Somewhat more broader, I would say that while all of what we talked about perhaps gave reason for hope, the reality is the farm and agricultural politics stink and make the types of changes we're talking about far slower than we would like. As I mentioned, it's politics why research has been undercut. It's politics why the adoption of the practices that Rebecca mentioned is so low. And it is why transition assistance, which makes a lot of sense to transition to perennial crops and to other crops that are more efficient, less wasteful, less water wasteful, lots of different reasons, would be politically challenging. Just to give one little data point on that, just to raise the issue of some of these transitions can get people into hot water. When the U.S. Department of Agriculture tried to, just as an educational matter, have Meatless Mondays in their own cafeterias, there was such an outcry that that idea was withdrawn within less than a day.
A question about carbon capture. Is it a reasonable policy to expect that photosynthesis may be the best strategy for achieving carbon capture? And to that point, if it is, why should agriculture be looked at as being a goal of being carbon neutral? Why isn't carbon positive? That is perhaps our most viable strategy for capturing carbon.
So it's not, so I'll talk about the science. So that's not my area of expertise. I have colleagues who work in, I'm sorry, that's not my area, photosynthesis isn't my area of expertise, but I can speak to some colleagues who are actually working on that. So it is a target to actually improve photosynthesis and capture, carbon capture, and there are some science programs that are actually looking at that. The scale of whether the mechanism and where they can push in the directions are part of the things that they're looking at, the kinetics associated with that. But I can't speak directly of, the numbers with that, but people are actively working on that.
And I'll just say, you got to walk before you run. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have agriculture and forestry certainly go beyond carbon neutrality. On the other hand, carbon neutrality would be an extraordinary achievement. And honestly, given the current politics, if we can aim there and can reasonably hope to get there, it would be one of the biggest carbon advances possible. Just to give you a sense of the scale, there was a study in Maryland that figured out that adoption of the healthy soil practices that Rebecca was talking about would have 4 times the carbon impact of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of Maryland. So huge opportunity here, but we're so far from it, we've got a ways to go. It was really quite exciting and a little ray of hope in the otherwise bleak politics that I mentioned, that the Senate Agriculture Committee recently held, I think in May, held its first ever hearing on agriculture and climate change. And to think about this is during the time when the party that controls the Senate still doesn't believe in climate change, and the Farm Bureau, one of the largest voices, still their official policy still is denying climate change, and yet they had a hearing on climate change in agriculture. And one of the witnesses, and it was a bipartisan witnesses, said we can make agriculture carbon neutral, and that was largely supported across the spectrum. So I think there is some hope that that can be a goal that makes sense, that is actually achievable and can get broad support.
And I'll just add one last thing too. The Nature Conservancy and a bunch of partners released some science that suggests that nature-based solutions can be 1/3 of the solution for global climate change. A lot of it has to come from decreasing carbon outputs, which is changing our energy system, but 1/3 of the solution can be nature-based. So, and as Peter referred to, that's agriculture and forestry. So there is a lot of hope.
So I've been involved in a group called the Slow Food Movement, which many of you have probably heard of. And the slow food promotes good, clean, and fair food and does not subscribe to veganism, but they do promote humane and sustainable methods of raising animal proteins. And from what I've read in my research over many years is that animal agriculture is an integral part of soil health, and in a sustainable fashion, not in a CAFO or factory farm, but on a farm where they're utilizing the animals to increase the soil health and rotating crops and rotating the animals through and grazing and bringing in a multiverse of creatures onto a farm. So I think that if the world could grasp their head that, okay, in their mind that they could still have meat, it's possible to have meat, but maybe a little less, maybe a half as much or 1/3 as much or even 1/4 as much every week, and be willing to pay maybe a little more to have it that often, we would have like an equilibrium that would be satisfactory for most of us in the developed world. I think people in the undeveloped world are looking for more, they want to become like us, so they have, fast food restaurants and things like that. But I think that there's a way to do it, and I think that that's an important thing to promote, so that farmers can say, well, there is a way that we could do this sustainably. I don't know, how do we teach our farmers how to do this sustainably and to understand that this is how we have to proceed?
So I think that, first I'll say that I absolutely believe that there's a multitude of approaches to all of these things, and what we need is balance. So there's never going to be extreme, everything should be organic, and there's never going to be extreme, everything should be not organic, right? It's going to be a mixture of solutions that gets us there. So yes, sometimes we speak in extremes of no beef, but I think you're right. There's sustainable consumption of beef. And to me, and I would look towards a lot of what Peter's been talking about, I think that there's so much political will and so many systems of incentives that are driving different behaviors. In my experience, which I don't have experience in agriculture all over the world, but in multiple places, farmers often lean in, especially some of the smaller farmers and the non-industrial farmers. Again, it's just access to the right incentives, the right methods that they'll be able to actually do the right sustainable things. That tends to be a big hurdle. Now, you do, of course, have the mass-produced cattle, and some of that's going to be driven by changes in demand. I truly do believe that we all have a role to play in this, and as our demand changes, the market changes. As the market changes, we'll start to see these solutions because that's what we're driving, that's what we're asking for. So I think it has to be a push and pull. So I think some of it can come from the farmers, if we can, especially if we can change the systems of incentives, change our policies, but I also think some of it can come from us. And as we start to change what we demand, the market will respond.
I would add to that that the organic food segment grew, doubled in 10 years. And that was completely consumer driven. So it's up to us.
You have the next question here.
I worked on a farm 35, 40 years ago, and we used to plant grass as a cover crop after the corn was harvested. But the problem that I see, the contradiction, is that would increase the need to till the soil in the spring to plant the seed. So I was wondering, in this 35, 40 years since I worked on a farm, have you been able to reduce the tillage that cover crops cause?
So you might actually have a better answer to that than I do. So.
Yeah, that's and another argument that is often mentioned is that cover crops are often, if not eliminated by tillage, they may be eliminated by herbicides. There's been a lot of research recently. Right now, still often much of it is private or done by farmers, but private, like by the Rodale Institute, on non-tillage, non-pesticidal ways of eliminating the cover crops. I think that's a perfect example of an area where there has been virtually no research funded by the federal government into how to do that. And if we spend a fraction of the money that we spend on all sorts of other things which are detrimental, we'd figure that one out pretty quickly.
And I think you make a great point about trade-offs too. If you have the cover crops, you reduce erosion during the non-growing season, but then you might have the consequence of greater tillage. And so there's no one gold star answer, but you have different advantages depending on different courses of action.
Yeah, and there are organic farmers who are just completely against no-till because it means they have to add herbicides. So we need more research.
So there are some very major corporations like Monsanto that not only do they get rid of legacy seeds, which do have the genetic capability of dealing with different types of weather-related environments, but they put out a monocrop, and then they also sell the pesticides and the fertilizers, and they tell the farmers, this is what you're going to use, and we want your legacy seeds. There are a couple of places around the world that actually, one I think is in Iceland, that actually has cold storage for thousands of different types of legacy seeds. But Monsanto's is a very strong corporate power in Washington and has a lot of money and influences the decisions that are made by farmers on what is actually going to be grown and what product and what fertilizers and what pesticides. And they're coming out with genetic plants that could take 5 times the amount of pesticide so that it won't kill the plant, but it kills all the bugs and it kills all the funguses. At the same time, it's in our soil, it's in our aquifer. So what do we do about that?
Do you want me? So I would actually say, I would agree with you that there is a concern that there are few companies that are basically managing the genetic diversity that's basically made available for growing. We've seen in the last 20 years a collapse from about anywhere from, depending upon the size you're looking at, 200 to 300 seed companies to about 5 large seed companies. So there is this elite group of individuals who are probably making decisions about which seeds to grow for, I want to call the big 5 or the big 7 crops. So with regard, I want to acknowledge that. Now, with regard to genetic diversity, I think that many of those companies are very aware of the need to basically exploit and make use of genetic diversity that exists. And in fact, I'm very aware that many of those companies are looking at understanding what genetic diversity they're missing and where they can actually go to get additional genetic diversity. Many of them are looking at how much, like I mentioned, that they can now breed for different microclimates in 3 cycles or 3-year cycle versus a 10-year cycle now opens up opportunity for many of those countries, many of those companies to increase the diversity of the seed that they're making and make it and optimize it for the different microclimates. Now, I can't address I can't address directly the point that you're making about the amount of chemicals and things that are being used. I do know that many of the companies and most farmers recognize that for sustainability moving forward, we need to reduce the amount of amendments and pesticides that we're putting on plants. And in fact, if many of you guys, many of those 3 favorite crops, the chocolate, the wine, the coffee, if you're in Europe right now, I mean, the bulk of the pesticides that are used across Europe are used on grapes. So this goes to, there are a few crops.
Not coffee.
This is grapes. There are a few crops that more heavily depend upon pesticides. So once again, it's a decision on which crops we're growing and how we're managing them and making good choices about that. But I would agree with you that there are a few companies that are making decisions on which seeds are made available.
Let me, if I can just say, obviously the political challenge is enormous. That concentration in the seed company and the pesticide company also means concentration of power. It's been actually, for the first time, an issue in this presidential campaign about putting a moratorium or slowing down agricultural mergers, because these aren't very good for farmers either, to only have 2 or 3 places that they can buy seeds, maybe only 1 in their region. So it hasn't been good for consumers, it hasn't been good for the environment, and it hasn't been good for the actual farmers. That hasn't been the trend, but I think we all need to push back on that, which is why there is beginning to be some interest in this. But it also goes back to the issue of where the research is going. Right now, that deficit in federal government research that I mentioned earlier is to some extent being taken up by private companies, which are largely putting research into things that can be patentable and sold, as opposed to better understanding of cover crops and how to get rid of them, how to terminate a cover crop without using herbicides or tillage, which would be really an open source issue. So we need to sort of think about the whole, as it were, ecosystem of knowledge as well.
So, hello. Thank you. I wanted to thank the labs, Nature Conservancy, and the panel. Very nice discussion. I particularly like the way you set it up from the doom and gloom to potential remedies, innovation. My question is to Doreen. How do you make someone who's concerned about the unintended consequences of genetic alterations to crops feel better about it? Is there how do we get around that issue? Thank you.
I think a large part of it is education. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So I think a large part of this is education. It is really educating people on what breeding has been doing for years and what breeding we're doing right now. I think that when we're looking at genetic engineering, we as humans have been genetically engineering and domesticating plants for a very, very long time, 10,000 years, right? What we're actually able to do now is we're actually able to do that faster, and we're able to actually learn and transfer that knowledge across crops. I think one of the most really valuable things in our arsenal is we're going to need to think about how do we domesticate new crops? How do we build new crops to deal with this new environment that we're going to be seeing? And can we learn from what we've done before? As far as educating the general public, I think most people are very, very disconnected from agriculture, right? They do not necessarily understand that genetic variation and basically breeding for a trait of interest has been something that we've been doing for years. It's just the methods by which we can do that now is changing. So many people, and I think that you're bringing up, there are traditional techniques that people have used to introduce novel genetic variation. Chemically treating seeds introduces novel genetic variation, and in fact, that's a common practice in many of the crops and vegetable crops that we have now. That new variation was introduced by chemical mutagenesis. The examples of GMOs, there are only a few really GMOs that are available, and those GMOs that are available right now that we were talking about earlier have been produced in such a way that there is an economic value associated with them, that there can be a return in investment for the farmers, basically. And what I mean by that is you can think about producing a GMO is very similar to producing a drug. One seed in an event really can cost anywhere from $100 million to $500 million. So many of the GMOs that we've seen introduced at this point in time associated with chemicals and the combination to improve yield on a grower's field are associated with where they can have return in the market. I think these newer technologies that we're going to be hearing about are going to allow us to mimic what natural genetic variation that we see. And I think educating people to the point that we're making changes that we would normally be seeing in natural variation, but now instead of it happening by chance, 1 in 10,000, and capturing that and then selecting for that, we have a much faster way of introducing that. I like to think about grapes. Many of us enjoy grapes. We've talked about grapes. Grapes are basically a crop that haven't had sex for 100 years. Okay? You know, they made these crosses, and they've been perennially propagated, and they've been clonally propagated. And what we have is we have versions of Chardonnay that have many mutations in it. And it doesn't look like Chardonnay did 100 years ago. But we could actually go in and make Chardonnay look like it looked like 100 years ago by introducing back changing some of the variation that we've seen. So I think basically educating people on how breeding has been done, how we're leveraging genetic variation that exists and we're just selecting on it, and how we have ways of introducing genetic variation in a very rapid way to actually produce crops that will be valuable for us as a consumer. I, for one, would like to see crops that have improved what I would call metabolites in it, right? So that I have healthier food. I would like to have crops that actually grow better on less inputs. And I can tell you that there are ways that we can do this, but basically educating people that these technologies that we're using now are just rapidly accelerating the way that we've done things in the past. But the way that we've done things in the past have been kind of hit or miss, okay? There was this variant there that happened, and I'm just selecting for it. Now I can basically create that variant very rapidly in the individual that's best suited for that environment. So when I think about genomes, going back to this, a genome just represents the potential of an organism, but how we manage it, what environment we put it in, is actually will give the final output. And with this climate change, we know these plants are going to be seeing many different environments. They haven't experienced it. We want to create a plant, a corn plant, that can handle waterlogging at 10 days, then can handle high heat conditions when it's filling its grain. And we want to be able to produce that in a way that it doesn't have what we would call a genetic load. Breeders have been doing this for years, but we can do it much quicker now.
Wow, what a great night. I'm so happy to be here and just right here at Cold Spring Harbor Labs have this kind of conversation. When I went to Cornell in 1969, I actually went into the agricultural department there and worked on a lot of projects. And one of my professors, Dr. Ehrlich, who's a major environmental professor, he was my professor at Cornell in those days. And everything he talked about in terms of the charts that you first projected about how much trouble we're in, were there in 1969. What exactly are we waiting for to create a sustainable planet? I was very instrumental working with NOFA, putting in the original organic qualifications, which have been, co-opted quite a bit by the USDA, not in a positive way. And another wonderful teacher was looking at, really, what about localization? Instead of expanding and expanding, downsizing. And there was an excellent farmer just on TV the other day who went back to traditional cow farming and just had grass. And he actually did measurements of how much carbon footprint his overall production created, and actually it helped reduce carbon emission over time. So there are solutions. Let's get to them. We can't keep talking about this another 30 years because now we're out of time. So thank you so much for tonight's presentation.